The world had descended into chaos. What was once a thriving civilization was now reduced to ruins, overrun by the relentless march of the undead. Cities lay in shambles, empty except for the echoes of the past. The survivors who remained had gathered in what seemed to be the last standing fortress, a military base located in the heart of a desolate wasteland. The fortress, surrounded by towering concrete walls and reinforced gates, had become a symbol of hope. For the handful of survivors who had found refuge inside, it was their last chance at survival. The walls were lined with makeshift barricades and guarded by weary sentries, who took turns scanning the horizon for any sign of danger. Inside, there were only a few hundred people left, including men, women, children, and the elderly. The fortress had been designed to withstand an attack, but it was not impervious to the horrors that lurked outside. The undead were relentless, and even the stronghold was beginning to show signs of wear. The air inside was thick with tension as everyone knew that it wasn't a matter of if the zombies would come, it was when. Among the survivors was Captain Aaron Davis, a seasoned leader who had once commanded a battalion before the world fell apart. She stood at the perimeter of the fortress, staring into the distance. Her face was worn, and her eyes held the weight of countless battles fought. She had seen the horrors of the apocalypse firsthand, but the fortress was her last chance to protect those she had sworn to defend. Beside her stood Lieutenant Michael Ross, a former Special Forces soldier who had become her most trusted ally. Michael had been a part of the team that helped fortify the base, and though he was ready for a fight, he knew the reality of their situation. The undead were evolving, growing more dangerous with every passing day. They were learning, adapting to the survivors' tactics. It wasn't long before they realized that brute force wasn't enough to stop the horde. "We can't keep living like this, Aaron," Michael muttered, his voice low and grim. "The zombies are closing in on us. We need a plan, and we need it now." Aaron nodded, her mind racing. The fortress was strong, but it was also isolated, and every day it grew harder to find resources. Their food supplies were dwindling, and ammunition was becoming scarce. They needed to act fast or risk losing everything they had fought for. "We can hold the line for a little while longer," Aaron said, though doubt lingered in her voice. "But we can't just wait for them to come. We have to take the fight to them." As she spoke, the distant sound of groaning could be heard, a familiar, haunting noise that sent a chill down their spines. The zombies were getting closer. The survivors had been on high alert for days, and now the time had come. The final stand had begun. The group gathered in the command center, where the air was thick with anxiety and anticipation. Each person knew that this would be their last chance to survive. The gates were strong, but they wouldn't hold forever, and the zombies were coming in larger numbers. Some had suggested leaving the fortress, but the idea was met with resistance. No one knew what the outside world held. There was no guarantee they would survive once they left the relative safety of their stronghold. Erin stood at the front of the room, her gaze steady and unwavering. She looked at her people, the last remaining fighters. "This is it," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "We are not running. We are not giving up. We will hold this line, no matter what." The survivors nodded, their expressions hardening with determination. They knew what they had to do, and each of them was ready to fight to the death. As the night fell, the sound of the undead grew louder, echoing through the desolate landscape. The survivors took their positions, preparing for the battle of their lives. The fate of the fortress, and their lives, rested in their hands. Would they be able to hold the line, or would the zombies overrun them, ending their fight for survival? The final stand had begun. The question remained, could these survivors hold the line, or would this fortress become their tomb? The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the fortified walls of the military base. Inside, the survivors braced for what they knew was coming, the siege. Captain Aaron Davis stood at the command center, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as she studied the map laid out before her. Each movement outside the gates sent ripples of anxiety through the room. The zombies were drawing near, their groans echoing off the walls like a distant wave of death. "They're getting closer," Lieutenant Michael Ross said, his voice tight with urgency. He stood at Aaron's side, his eyes fixed on the long-range cameras that had been placed around the perimeter of the fortress. At least a few hundred, maybe more. And they're not just aimlessly wandering, they're heading straight for us. Erin's gaze remained locked on the map, her mind racing. She knew the fortress was their last hope, but it was far from impervious. If the undead were smart enough to coordinate their attacks, they might just breach the walls. She couldn't let that happen. "We're going to need every hand on deck tonight," Erin said, her voice steady but commanding. "I want all of our fighters to take their positions at the north and east gates. We'll reinforce the barricades. No one moves until the first wave hits." The survivors, some still young and others too old to fight, exchanged nervous glances but nodded in agreement. They had trained for moments like this, survival was all that mattered now. Michael met Erin's eyes. "Are we really doing this? Are we staying here to fight?" He asked the question as if hoping for a different answer, but Erin's resolve was unwavering. "This is our home. And as long as we still draw breath, we fight." With a sharp nod, Michael turned to organize the survivors. The command center bustled with activity as everyone prepared for what could be their final stand. The sound of boots pounding against the concrete floor echoed through the hallways as fighters took their posts. The hum of the generators, which powered the fortress lights and communications, buzzed in the background, providing an odd sense of security amid the impending danger. Erin watched the preparations for a moment before stepping outside into the cool night air. The wind carried the faintest scent of decay, and the horizon was dark with the approaching horde. The gates, sturdy and reinforced, appeared to stand strong, but she knew better than to trust them completely. "We'll hold them as long as we can," she whispered to herself, then turned to Michael, who was walking toward her. "They're close," Michael reported, his face set in grim determination. "They're starting to move faster. It's like they're adapting to our patterns. They've learned." Erin clenched her fists, feeling the weight of his words settle heavily on her shoulders. "We can't let that stop us. If they've learned, then we need to get smarter, too." As the night wore on, the tension grew. The survivors manned the walls and stood ready with weapons at the gates. The barricades were reinforced as best they could be, though there was no denying the limitations of their resources. Gunfire had become a last resort, only to be used when the undead were too close for comfort. The focus was on defense, and it was clear that this fight would require every ounce of strength they had left. Suddenly, a shrill alarm sounded throughout the base, cutting through the silence like a knife. The horde had arrived. The first wave came with terrifying speed. They appeared out of the darkness, pouring in from all sides like a relentless tide. The survivors fired their weapons in unison, taking down as many as they could, but the undead kept coming. Their numbers were staggering, and their hunger for human flesh was insatiable. Erin's heart pounded in her chest as she moved to the front lines, giving orders and rallying her people. "Hold the gates! Do not let them in," she shouted, her voice carrying across the battlefield. At the north gate, Michael fired into the approaching horde, his aim steady as he took down one zombie after another. He glanced over at Erin, his expression tense. "We can't keep this up forever. We need to act fast." Erin nodded, her eyes scanning the walls. "Keep firing. I'll lead a small team to the west perimeter to try and flank them." Michael didn't hesitate. "Be careful." With a quick nod, Erin rallied a small group of fighters and headed for the west side, hoping to gain an advantage by attacking the zombies from behind. But as they moved through the base's narrow alleyways, they encountered something unexpected, another wave of zombies, far larger than they had anticipated, creeping in from the shadows. It was as if they were being herded toward the fortress. "How did they?" Erin started, but before she could finish her sentence, the first of the zombies came into view, followed by hundreds more. Their numbers were overwhelming. In that moment, Erin realized the truth: they weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting to keep their last shred of hope intact. The battle had begun, and nothing would be the same after this night. The question now wasn't just whether they could hold the line, it was how long they could last. The first wave hit the fortress hard, and as the night drew on, the survivors found themselves in the thick of battle. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the undead crashed against the walls, their guttural growls rising above the chaos. The fortress, once a sanctuary of hope, had now become a battleground where every inch mattered. Every step forward for the zombies meant another step closer to the survivors' doom. Erin and her team pushed forward through the west perimeter, the air thick with gunfire and the acrid scent of sweat and fear. The barricades had held, but only just. The zombies were adapting faster than they could have imagined, forming coordinated groups to breach weak points in the defenses. "We can't stay here long," one of the fighters, Private Sanchez, shouted over the deafening noise. He fired his rifle into the advancing horde, but it was clear that the numbers were too great. The undead were relentless, and every time they took one down, two more seemed to take their place. Erin's mind raced as she analyzed their situation. Their ammunition was dwindling, and the fortress was already starting to show signs of strain. The gates would hold for a while, but they wouldn't last forever. The true question was how long they could keep the zombies from breaking through before the survivors ran out of options. "Fall back. Back to the gates," Erin ordered, her voice cutting through the noise. They turned and raced back toward the central courtyard, but as they neared the gates, a terrifying realization hit Erin like a punch to the gut. The zombies had split into groups, some attacking the gates, while others were systematically surrounding the entire fortress. The horde was becoming more organized, more strategic. It wasn't just a mindless attack, it was a siege. "Damn it!" Erin cursed under her breath. "They're trying to trap us inside." Michael's voice came through her earpiece, urgent and tight with panic. "Erin, we've got a breach at the east wall. We need reinforcements, now." Erin's heart skipped a beat. The east wall had always been one of the strongest parts of the fortress, and now it was compromised. "Hold your position. We'll be there in 5 minutes," she responded, her tone steady despite the rising panic in her chest. As they sprinted back toward the east side, Erin's mind swirled with thoughts of the fortress' fate. It was clear now, this wasn't just about surviving another night. It was about surviving the strategy of an enemy that was learning, adapting, and evolving. The horde had become more than a simple group of undead. They were a force. By the time Erin reached the east wall, the damage was already done. The gates had been partially torn down, and the undead had breached the outer barricades. A group of survivors was fighting valiantly, but their numbers were dwindling. Blood, sweat, and exhaustion stained their faces as they held the line, each one fighting not just for their lives but for the lives of everyone inside the fortress. Erin didn't waste a second. "Sanchez, cover me," she shouted as she dashed toward the breach. Her team moved quickly, taking up positions to repel the incoming zombies. The survivors at the wall were doing their best to hold the line, but it was clear that they couldn't keep up much longer. Michael appeared at Erin's side, his rifle raised. "They're closing in fast. We've got to take out that horde before they overrun the walls." Erin nodded, her face grim. "We need to push them back, at any cost." The battle intensified. The zombies pressed harder, and every shot fired seemed to be met with two more zombies advancing. The survivors' guns blazed through the night, but the sheer volume of undead was overwhelming. The once pristine walls of the fortress were now marked with deep gouges, the signs of a siege in full force. As the seconds ticked by, the survivors were beginning to feel the weight of their situation. For every zombie they took down, more took their place. The west gate had been reinforced, but the east wall was a different story. It was crumbling under the relentless pressure. "We can't do this for much longer," Sanchez said between shots, his voice strained. "We need more ammo, reinforcements, anything." Erin clenched her jaw. "We can't wait for help. We have to hold the line here and now." With determination hardening her resolve, Erin motioned to Michael. "Let's push them back. We fight them at the wall. No retreat." The two of them, alongside a handful of survivors, threw themselves at the front line, cutting down zombies with precision. But no matter how many they killed, there were always more. They were trapped in a nightmare of their own making, the undead circling around them like vultures waiting for the moment of weakness. Michael swung his rifle over his shoulder and reached for a nearby grenade. "We need to create an opening," he said. "This will buy us some time." Aaron hesitated for a moment but then nodded in agreement. Michael pulled the pin, and the grenade soared through the air, exploding with a deafening roar. The blast scattered the zombies, creating a temporary gap in the horde. "Move!" Aaron yelled, grabbing Michael's arm as they sprinted through the breach. The survivors followed closely behind them, taking advantage of the opening to fall back toward the central courtyard. But as Aaron looked back at the battlefield, her heart sank. They weren't just holding the line anymore, they were running out of time. The fortress was no longer just a sanctuary, it was a trap. And soon, it would be overrun. The fortress was starting to feel like a coffin, a sanctuary turned prison, surrounded by an unrelenting tide of the undead. Inside the walls, the survivors fought with all they had, but as the minutes dragged on, exhaustion set in. The zombies weren't just attacking, they were wearing them down, testing their resolve. Every barricade, every wall, every door seemed like it was only a moment away from falling. Aaron surveyed the courtyard, her eyes darting from one survivor to the next. The sight was grim, bloodied faces, weary bodies, weapons running low on ammo. The undead were relentless, never giving up, always pushing forward. The few safe spots inside the fortress were shrinking, and the few survivors left were running out of options. "We can't keep doing this forever," Michael said, his voice strained with fatigue. He wiped the sweat off his brow and glanced toward the horizon, where the undead were closing in from every direction. "We're not done yet," Aaron replied, her tone hard and unwavering. She wasn't ready to give up, not when they had fought so hard to survive this long. But even she could feel the weight of the situation. "Get to the armory. We need whatever we can use to fight back." Michael hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, the urgency in his eyes matching hers. "On it." As Michael and a few others sprinted toward the armory, Aaron turned back toward the battlefield. There was no way they could keep up this fight forever, not without reinforcements. But those were long gone. The rest of the world had crumbled, and this fortress, once a symbol of hope, was now a tiny island surrounded by the relentless sea of the undead. The command center was a flurry of activity as survivors patched up injuries, distributed weapons, and made last-ditch plans to strengthen the barricades. Aaron's mind raced. There had to be another way out of this. Another solution. But what? The walls were weakening, and the supply runs had become increasingly dangerous. The night was long, and there was no sign of relief in sight. "Aaron," shouted one of the survivors from the perimeter, her voice laced with panic. "We've got a breach at the south gate. They've broken through." Aaron's heart dropped as she turned to face the command center. If the south gate fell, they would be surrounded on all sides. There would be nowhere left to retreat to. "Gather the remaining fighters. Move to the south gate, now." The survivors rushed toward the breach, weapons in hand, but the strain on their faces was evident. They had fought so hard, but they could see the walls closing in. As Aaron reached the south gate, the sight before her took her breath away. The zombies had broken through the lower barricades, and a flood of them was pouring in. The survivors at the gate were struggling to hold back the flood, but it was clear they wouldn't last long. Aaron pulled out her rifle and took aim, firing at the zombies. Her shots were precise, each one taking down an undead creature, but it didn't slow the tide. They were outnumbered, and the undead were closing in faster than they could handle. "We can't hold them," shouted one of the survivors, his voice rising in panic. "There's too many." Aaron gritted her teeth, her grip tightening on her rifle. She wasn't about to give in, not now, not after everything they had been through. "We don't have the luxury of giving up," she shouted back, rallying the group. "We hold the line here. No one falls back." But even as she said it, Aaron knew the truth, holding the line was becoming impossible. Suddenly, a new sound cut through the air, a low, rumbling noise that made the ground beneath their feet tremble. Aaron froze, her mind racing as she tried to place the sound. It was too rhythmic to be the typical groans of the undead. "Wait," Michael's voice came through the radio, shaking with disbelief. "Aaron, there's something else out here. Something different." Before Aaron could respond, the rumbling grew louder, and the air was filled with an eerie screeching sound. The ground shifted beneath their feet, and the gates shook as though something massive was pushing against them. "Aaron, get back to the command center, now!" Michael shouted over the radio. "It's not just zombies, there's something else coming. Something big." Aaron's heart pounded in her chest. The undead had evolved, but this was something new, something far more dangerous. She motioned to the survivors to fall back toward the command center. They were already spread thin, and the south gate was about to collapse under the force of whatever was approaching. As they rushed back toward the heart of the fortress, Aaron's mind raced. She had fought zombies before, but this felt different. Something was coming, something they weren't prepared for. Whatever it was, they had to be ready. Inside the command center, Michael was already organizing the remaining fighters. "Aaron, we need a new plan. The zombies are one thing, but whatever is coming is something else. If we don't act now, it's going to be too late." Aaron looked at the map on the wall, her eyes scanning for any possible escape routes. But there were none. The fortress was their last stand. If they couldn't hold it, they were done. "What do we do?" a young fighter asked, his face pale with fear. Aaron took a deep breath, forcing herself to focus. There was no more time for hesitation. "We do what we've always done," she said, her voice unwavering. "We fight. No matter what." But as she said the words, she knew one thing for certain: the battle was far from over. It was about to get much, much worse. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the mysterious rumbling grew louder. It was no longer just the undead pressing in, they were accompanied by something far more terrifying. Aaron felt a chill crawl up her spine as the walls of the fortress seemed to groan under the strain of the advancing threat. It wasn't just a breach, it was an invasion. The survivors gathered inside the command center, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear. No one spoke as the rumbling continued, growing in intensity. Michael, standing beside Aaron, was the first to break the silence. His voice was barely a whisper. "This is no normal horde. We've seen the undead change, but this is something else." Aaron's mind raced. Could it be another mutation? Was this the next stage of the infection? There was no way to know for sure, but whatever it was coming for them. "Everyone, stay alert," Aaron called out, her voice steady despite the storm of questions swirling in her mind. "Get ready for anything." She motioned to the survivors, all of them now armed and anxious, and issued orders to reinforce the gates. It was clear they wouldn't be able to stop whatever was coming with their current defenses. They needed a plan, a way to fight back. A faint, eerie growl echoed through the fortress, followed by another rumbling tremor. This wasn't just a horde of mindless zombies, it was something different. Something stronger. And it was closing in fast. "Aaron," Michael said, his voice trembling. "It's coming from the east. I've never heard anything like it." Aaron's eyes narrowed. The east side was the most fortified, but they had already suffered a breach there earlier in the night. Now, if whatever this new threat was could get through, they would be trapped. There was no escape route left. "We need to find out what we're dealing with," Aaron said firmly. "Get the surveillance system up. Now." As the team scrambled to gather whatever they could to monitor the eastern perimeter, Aaron's mind wandered back to the moments before the rumbling started. Could they have missed something? A new breed of infected? Something that could tear down their walls? The thought gnawed at her insides. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being hunted by something much more intelligent, far more dangerous than the typical mindless horde. Suddenly, the cameras flickered to life, and Aaron's breath caught in her throat. The feed revealed a mass of undead gathered just outside the eastern wall, fewer than before, but they were clearly waiting. And they weren't alone. From the shadows emerged a massive figure, hulking, with twisted, unnatural limbs and skin that seemed to ripple and shift as if it were alive, even in the stillness of the night. The beast was taller than any man, its face a grotesque mask of sharp teeth and bulging, bloodshot eyes. It seemed almost to be commanding the zombies, leading them with an eerie sense of purpose. "Oh my God," one of the survivors whispered, unable to tear his eyes away from the screen. "Is that?" Michael stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "It's not possible," Erin muttered, shaking her head in disbelief. "This isn't just a mutation. This is something new. Something far worse than we could have imagined." The beast's movements were slow, deliberate, but each step sent shockwaves through the ground. The zombies around it seemed to follow its lead, turning toward the walls of the fortress with renewed aggression. It wasn't just leading them, it was orchestrating their movements, as if it understood the layout of the fortress. "Everyone, get to your positions," Erin shouted, her voice cutting through the stunned silence in the room. "Now!" The survivors scrambled to their stations, the fear palpable in the air. Erin's mind raced as she quickly formulated a plan. They needed to stop that beast. If they didn't, they wouldn't stand a chance. But how? Her thoughts were interrupted by another, more deafening growl, followed by a series of crashing noises. The beast had launched itself at the fortress, and its impact sent shockwaves through the walls. The ground shook violently, and the entire east wall rattled under the force of the creature's assault. "We're not going to hold it much longer," Michael shouted over the chaos, his eyes wide with panic. Erin's mind spun as she tried to process everything at once. The beast was far stronger than any zombie they had encountered. It wasn't just physical, there was an intelligence behind its movements, a twisted form of strategy that made it a far more dangerous foe than any horde they had fought before. "Fire at the beast. Take out its legs. Slow it down," Erin ordered, her voice cutting through the chaos. She could already see the results of their limited ammunition, each bullet seemed to do little more than annoy the creature. The beast was unstoppable, like a freight train barreling toward them. A massive roar ripped through the air as the creature slammed its body against the fortress walls. The barricade shook, and dust fell from the ceiling. The survivors fired their weapons frantically, but their efforts barely seemed to faze it. The beast was far more resilient than any zombie they had fought before. "We need more firepower," Erin shouted, her heart pounding in her chest. "Move to the armory. Get everything we can." But even as she barked orders, Erin couldn't shake the horrible feeling creeping up her spine. This was the beginning of something far worse than they could have prepared for. The beast wasn't just a force of nature. It was a predator. And they were its prey. The final stand wasn't going to be a fight against mindless zombies, it was going to be a battle against something far worse, something that seemed to be planning every move with deadly precision. The survivors were running out of time. They couldn't stop the beast with their current resources. They had to make a choice, fight and hope for survival, or face annihilation. But Erin knew one thing, there was no turning back now. The fortress was their last stand. The beast's growl rumbled through the fortress, shaking the very foundation beneath their feet. Erin could feel the walls of the command center vibrating with the sheer force of the creature's assault. The survivors were scrambling, trying to get into position, but the overwhelming power of the creature made everything seem futile. Every shot they fired at it seemed to have no effect, just a dull thud against its grotesque, mutated body. Erin's heart raced. They had been expecting a breach, but not like this. The beast's monstrous size and unnatural resilience made the zombies look like mere pests. With each crash against the walls, it seemed to grow more determined, more relentless. It was not simply attacking, it was demolishing, eroding their last hope for survival. "Erin, we can't stop it. We're out of time," Michael shouted from the corner of the command center, his face pale and his voice filled with desperation. He was clutching his rifle like a lifeline, but even he knew it wasn't enough. Erin stood frozen for a moment, staring at the screen showing the beast's progress. The eastern wall was buckling under its assault. The creature's massive claws scraped against the stone, tearing through the fortifications like they were made of paper. Every attempt to fire back had failed. The survivors were running low on ammo, and it was becoming clear that the fortress wasn't built to withstand an enemy like this. "Get the explosives," Erin ordered, her voice sharp, cutting through the panic. We're going to have to make this count. The survivors moved with urgency, gathering every bit of firepower they could find. But as Erin watched the beast tear through the walls, a sinking feeling filled her chest. She had led them this far, but now it seemed the end was inevitable. Erin! Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. They're coming in from the west too. The zombies, there's too many of them. Erin turned sharply, eyes wide. The fortress was being surrounded. The east wall was failing, and now the zombies were crawling through the gaps, relentless as ever. They had no choice but to hold the line. Move to the inner sanctum. Erin commanded, pulling her team toward the deepest, most secure part of the fortress. It was their last safe spot, a place where they could at least regroup, if only for a moment. But the sound of the beast's deafening roars filled the air, and she knew their time was running out. As they moved quickly through the corridors, Erin's mind raced. She had never considered that they might be up against something this powerful, something with a mind of its own. She had been prepared for zombies, even the mutated ones. But this was something entirely different. The survivors reached the inner sanctum and quickly fortified the doors. Erin felt her breath quicken as she tried to think of a way out. They couldn't fight this creature with conventional weapons, and they couldn't hold out in this room forever. The walls were reinforced, but even that might not be enough. We can't stay here, Erin, one of the survivors said, panic rising in their voice. If it gets through, we're done. Erin gritted her teeth. She knew the situation was dire. But as she stood there, looking around at the terrified faces of the survivors, one thought stood out in her mind: they had come too far to give up now. They weren't going to go down without a fight. We don't have much choice, Erin said firmly, trying to keep her voice steady. But we need to buy some time. She turned to Michael. Is there any way we can collapse part of the east wall? 'Cause a distraction? Michael hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the room. It's risky, he said, but we can try. If we can use the explosives in the right place, we might be able to block it off, at least for a little while. Do it, Erin said without hesitation. We don't have much time. The survivors quickly set to work, preparing the explosives. Erin could hear the beast's roars growing louder, accompanied by the scraping sound of its claws against the walls. The zombies were getting closer, their moans echoing through the hallways. But Erin didn't allow herself to think about that now. They had one shot at survival. As the explosives were set, Erin motioned for the survivors to fall back toward the inner sanctum. Everyone, get ready to move, she said, her voice steely with determination. Once that wall collapses, we go. We run for the back exit. No matter what happens, we keep moving. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. The moment of truth was fast approaching. If this didn't work, they would be trapped, out of options, out of time. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Erin's pulse quickened as she heard the muffled countdown from the other room. Then, with a deafening explosion, the fortress shuddered. The wall buckled, and dust filled the air as a massive section of the eastern barricade crumbled under the force of the blast. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the beast's roar ripped through the air, louder than ever before. It had been momentarily stalled by the debris, but the survivors could hear it moving again, more furious, more determined than before. We go now! Erin shouted. Run! The survivors bolted, running through the hallways toward the back exit. The air was thick with dust and debris, and the sound of the beast's approach reverberated through the walls. Erin pushed herself harder, her legs burning, her breath coming in ragged gasps. They had to get out, had to make it to safety before the beast tore through the rest of their defenses. But as they neared the exit, Erin realized with a sinking feeling that the fight wasn't over. The beast was already inside. And it was coming for them. The back exit was within sight, a glimmer of hope in the suffocating darkness that surrounded them. The survivors sprinted through the crumbling corridors, their footsteps pounding in unison. The weight of their impending doom pressed heavily on Erin's chest, but she kept her focus, her mind racing with the knowledge that this might be their only chance to escape. The beast's growls echoed through the fortress, shaking the walls with each passing second. It was close. Too close. Erin could feel the ground tremble beneath her as the creature's monstrous form surged forward, relentless and unstoppable. They were out of time. "We're almost there," Michael shouted from behind, his voice filled with desperation. "Just a little further." Erin's legs burned, each step harder than the last, but she pushed forward. She could hear the survivors behind her, their breaths heavy, the panic rising as the roar of the beast grew louder. It was right on their heels, closing in like a predator stalking its prey. As they reached the exit, Erin's heart skipped a beat. The door, once their lifeline, was now blocked. Rubble from the explosion had fallen, sealing their only escape route. Her breath caught in her throat as she stared at the debris. "No!" Erin shouted, her voice cracking with frustration and fear. "Move it! We need to clear that door." The survivors scrambled to push the debris away, but it was a hopeless task. The rubble was too heavy, and the beast was too close. Erin could hear the sound of its claws scraping against the stone, a chilling reminder of how little time they had left. "Erin!" Michael shouted again, his voice laced with panic. "It's coming! We don't have a choice." Erin turned to him, her face pale, her mind racing. There was no time left to clear the door. No time for a plan. The only option left was to face the beast head-on. "Get ready," Erin said, her voice barely a whisper. "We fight. We hold the line as long as we can." The survivors exchanged nervous glances, their faces etched with fear and uncertainty. But Erin could see the determination in their eyes. They were ready to do whatever it took to survive, even if it meant making the ultimate sacrifice. The beast's roar grew louder, and Erin's heart pounded in her chest. There was no turning back now. The creature was almost upon them, its massive form filling the hallway, blocking their only path. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory hunger, and its massive claws clicked against the stone floor with a rhythm that sent shivers down Erin's spine. Erin motioned for the survivors to take their positions, forming a semicircle around the entrance. They had limited weapons and even fewer options. The beast was too strong, too fast, and it seemed to be almost impervious to their attacks. But they had to fight. They had to buy enough time for someone, anyone, to make it out. "On my mark," Erin whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "Aim for its eyes. We need to blind it." The survivors nodded, each of them pulling their weapons into position. Erin's hands shook as she raised her rifle, her heart hammering in her chest. This was it. The final stand. The beast lunged forward with a terrifying speed, its jaws snapping just inches from Erin's face. She barely had time to react, but the survivors fired as one, unleashing a volley of shots aimed at its eyes. The creature howled in pain, its massive form writhing in agony as it staggered back. For a moment, Erin thought they might have succeeded. But the beast quickly recovered, its rage growing even more intense. It charged forward again, this time faster than before. Erin felt the air shift as the creature's monstrous presence closed in, and her mind screamed at her to run. But there was nowhere to go. The only way out was through the monster. "Fall back!" Erin shouted, pushing the survivors toward the walls of the hallway. "Get behind the pillars." The survivors scrambled to get out of the way, but the beast was too fast. It reached one of them, its claws swiping through the air and catching the unfortunate survivor off guard. With a sickening crunch, the survivor was thrown against the wall, lifeless before they even hit the ground. Erin's stomach twisted as she turned her focus back to the beast. There was no stopping it, not without a miracle. They had nothing left. No ammunition, no backup, and the fortress was collapsing around them. The walls were crumbling, the ceiling buckling as the beast continued its relentless assault. Suddenly, Erin's mind snapped back to the explosives they had planted earlier. The blast had caused some damage, but they hadn't fully detonated. There was still a chance to use the remaining charges to destroy the beast, or at least slow it down long enough for the survivors to escape. Her eyes locked onto the pile of explosives near the shattered doorway. It was a long shot, but it was their only hope. "Michael!" Aaron shouted, turning to him. "Get to the explosives. Detonate them now. We have to take it down." Michael hesitated, fear flashing across his face. But there was no time for hesitation. With a determined nod, he sprinted toward the explosives. The beast roared in fury as it lunged at another survivor. Aaron could hear the screams and the sickening crunch of bones, but she couldn't afford to look away. She had to focus. She had to survive. "Now!" Aaron shouted as Michael triggered the detonator. The explosion was deafening. The entire hallway seemed to collapse in on itself, and the fortress shook violently as the beast howled in pain. Dust and debris filled the air, and Aaron could barely see through the smoke. She heard the creature's agonized roars growing quieter, but she knew this wasn't over yet. The explosion might have slowed it down, but the fight was far from finished. Aaron's heart pounded as she waited for the smoke to clear. The final charge had bought them a moment, but would it be enough? There was only one way to find out. The smoke from the explosion still lingered, thick and suffocating, curling through the shattered halls of the fortress like a dark omen. Aaron's eyes watered as she squinted through the haze, her pulse racing. The sound of the beast's roars had faded, but she knew that silence in a battle like this was never a good sign. Is it gone?" Michael's voice cracked as he peered into the smoke, clutching a rifle with shaky hands. He was still covered in dust and blood, but his eyes betrayed the same fear Aaron felt deep inside. He wasn't ready to hope yet, not after all they had been through. Aaron slowly stepped forward, her body moving on autopilot, guided by the instinct to survive. She kept her rifle raised, her gaze darting between the shifting shadows. The walls were barely standing, the once impenetrable fortress now a crumbling shell, filled with the echoes of their desperate last stand. "I don't know," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Stay alert." Then, through the fog, there came the unmistakable sound of something massive moving. The floor trembled beneath their feet again, and the roar of the beast broke the silence, this time more pained, more ragged. It was still alive. But it was hurt, slowing down, its movements staggered by the blast. "It's not over yet," Aaron whispered to herself, though she hardly believed it. Without warning, the creature emerged from the smoke, a hulking figure limping toward them. Its eyes were bloodshot and disoriented, one of them completely blinded from the blast, but it was still terrifying. Its size and rage were enough to make the very air feel suffocating. The explosion had wounded it, but it was far from defeated. "Fall back!" Aaron shouted as she raised her rifle, aiming for the beast's remaining eye. But the creature had learned from its earlier mistake. It was no longer charging blindly, it moved with caution now, circling them like a predator preparing for the final strike. The survivors scattered, looking for any cover they could find. Aaron's mind was racing, she needed to think quickly. The beast's resilience had exceeded all expectations. They had been out of options before, and now it seemed they were out of time, too. Then, an idea sparked in her mind. The explosives. They still had a chance to use them strategically, to finish the job. But there was a problem, the detonator was in Michael's hands. And he was pinned down on the far side of the hallway, near a crumbling wall. The creature's attention was now fully on him. "Michael!" Aaron shouted, her voice slicing through the chaos. "Get to the explosives. Now!" Michael looked over at her, his eyes wide with panic, but he nodded and started to move, slowly at first, then faster, realizing the danger of staying still. But the beast was fast, and it noticed him almost immediately. It charged, its remaining eye burning with primal fury. "No!" Aaron shouted, but it was too late. The creature lunged toward Michael just as he reached the pile of explosives, knocking him back. The detonator flew from his hands, skidding across the floor toward Aaron. She dove for it without thinking, her fingers brushing the cold surface of the detonator. But before she could grab it, the beast's enormous claw slashed through the air, missing her by inches. She rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding its strike. The detonator was now out of reach. Desperation gripped Erin's heart as she turned toward the creature, her rifle trembling in her hands. Michael was still down, struggling to stand, but he was too far away from the detonator. The beast was closing in on him again, its jaws snapping. "Get up, Michael!" Erin screamed. "You have to get the detonator." Michael's eyes met hers, and for a split second, there was a flicker of understanding. He was hurt, but he wasn't about to let this monster take them down. With a painful grunt, he pushed himself to his feet and staggered toward the detonator, just as the creature lunged for him. But Erin wasn't going to let that happen. With one final burst of strength, she sprinted forward, positioning herself between the beast and Michael. Her rifle raised, she fired 1, 2, 3 shots. The creature recoiled, a snarl of pain escaping its mouth as the bullets found their mark. It staggered back, but it was still standing. "Michael, now!" Erin shouted, her voice raw with emotion. Michael didn't hesitate. He grabbed the detonator, pressed the button, and the world exploded. The blast was deafening. Erin felt herself thrown to the ground as the shockwave rippled through the fortress. Dust, rubble, and debris filled the air, and for a moment, the world was nothing but chaos and noise. She covered her head, bracing herself for the worst. When the dust finally began to settle, Erin slowly opened her eyes, her body aching, her head spinning. The creature was gone. The ground was littered with debris, but the beast had been obliterated by the explosion, its body a twisted mess of burned flesh and broken bones. The fortress was no longer standing, but they had survived. Erin pushed herself up, her limbs trembling with exhaustion. Michael was by her side, his face pale but alive. The others slowly gathered around, battered but standing. It had taken everything they had, every ounce of strength, every last bit of hope, but they had held the line. The beast was dead. The fortress had fallen, but they had survived. And that, Erin realized, was all that mattered. "Let's go," Erin said, her voice hoarse but filled with determination. "The world may be gone, but we're still here." The survivors nodded, ready to move on, whatever came next. The last stand inside the fortress was over, but their journey was far from finished.